You can always tell who was born rich by the way they laugh at people they think don't belong. The laughter rolled softly beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Grand Meridian Ballroom, polished and expensive like everything else in Midtown Manhattan that night. Servers moved silently between tables draped in white silk, while violin music floated through the air warm as candlelight. But near the center of the room, at the Whitmore family's private VIP table, the mood shifted the moment red wine splashed across Vanessa Cole's dark emerald gown. The stain spread slowly near her waist, deep and ugly against the fabric. For half a second, the ballroom seemed to pause. Then Olivia Whitmore leaned back in her chair with a smile, so thin it barely counted as human warmth. "Unbelievable," she muttered loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "These people really will hire anyone these days." A few guests chuckled under their breath. Daniel Whitmore laughed louder than the rest. "Relax, Mom," he said, lifting his bourbon glass. "She probably works housekeeping upstairs anyway." More laughter followed, polished and restrained, the kind rich people used when they wanted cruelty to sound elegant. Vanessa stood perfectly still beside the table, one hand lightly touching the stem of her champagne glass, while the other held the folded napkin she had used to stop the wine from dripping onto the marble floor. She didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't defend herself. The younger waitress beside her looked terrified, barely 20 years old, hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped the silver tray she carried. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," the girl whispered. "It was an accident." Olivia Whitmore didn't even look at her. "Then maybe you're in the wrong profession." The words landed cold and sharp beneath the soft violin music. Vanessa slowly turned toward the frightened waitress and gently took the tray from her shaking hands. "It's all right," she said calmly. Her voice was low, steady, impossible to provoke. "Nobody got hurt." Daniel watched her for a moment, amused by how composed she seemed. "You know," he said with a smirk, "for staff, you clean up pretty well." Another ripple of laughter moved around the table. Nearby executives glanced over awkwardly before quickly looking away. Nobody wanted to interfere with the Whitmores. Not tonight. Not with cameras flashing near the ballroom entrance and reporters waiting downstairs for comments about the rumored $5 billion merger scheduled for the next morning. Vanessa finally lifted her eyes toward Daniel. Calm eyes. Intelligent eyes. The kind that noticed everything. But Daniel didn't see that. All he saw was a black woman standing too close to his family's table, without diamonds around her neck or a billionaire hanging from her arm. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and slid it across the edge of the table toward her. "Here," he said casually. "Buy yourself another dress." This time, the laughter came easier. Sharper. Even Olivia smiled into her wineglass. Vanessa looked down at the folded bill resting beside the silverware. The ballroom lights reflected softly across the polished marble floor, while somewhere behind her, another violinist missed a note. She picked up the bill carefully between two fingers and studied it for a moment, as if deciding whether it was worth anything at all. Then she folded it once. Perfectly. Slowly. Deliberately. When she looked back up, her expression never changed. "Do you always confuse kindness for weakness?" she asked quietly. The question settled over the table like sudden winter air. Daniel's smile faltered just slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But Vanessa noticed. She noticed everything. Across the ballroom, several executives had stopped talking entirely. One older banker near the bar stared at Vanessa with widening eyes of recognition before quickly lowering his drink. Near the entrance, a nervous corporate attorney checked his phone for the fourth time in under 2 minutes. Sweat glistened faintly near his collar despite the cold air conditioning flowing through the ballroom vents. He scanned the room again anxiously, searching for someone. Searching for her. But at the Whitmore table, nobody noticed the shift yet. Nobody understood that the woman they had spent the last 10 minutes humiliating was the only reason their collapsing empire still had a chance to survive the week. And Vanessa Cole, standing quietly beneath the chandelier light with wine staining her dress, had not said a single word about who she really was. Daniel Whitmore hated silence because silence forced people to think, and for the first time that evening, nobody at the table seemed sure what to say next. The violinists continued playing near the ballroom stage, but the energy around the Whitmore family had shifted almost imperceptibly, like cold air slipping beneath a locked door. Vanessa Cole placed the folded $100 bill beside Daniel's untouched bourbon glass and calmly handed the silver tray back to the young waitress standing beside her. "Take a breath," she whispered softly to the girl. "You are doing fine." The waitress nodded quickly, eyes glossy with embarrassment before disappearing toward the kitchen entrance. Olivia Whitmore watched the interaction with visible annoyance. "You would think people working these events would learn professionalism," she muttered, adjusting the diamonds around her neck. Vanessa said nothing. Her silence irritated Olivia more than anger would have. Across the ballroom, camera flashes burst near the grand staircase as politicians, investors, and celebrities posed beneath the towering gold banners of the Whitmore Foundation annual charity gala. Every inch of the room smelled expensive. White roses lined the marble columns. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead like floating fire. Men in tailored tuxedos moved through the crowd, carrying glasses worth more than some people's monthly rent. Yet beneath all the polished luxury, tension lingered in hidden corners of the room. Everyone important knew Whitmore Global was bleeding money. The newspapers had not confirmed it yet, but Wall Street always smelled fear before the public did. Failed tech acquisitions, mounting debt, investors quietly pulling away. The family empire that had dominated Manhattan for 3 generations was beginning to crack beneath its own weight. And tomorrow morning's acquisition meeting with Cole and Mercer Capital was supposed to stop the collapse before. The markets opened on Monday. Daniel leaned back in his chair with the lazy confidence of a man who had never truly faced consequences in his life. "So tell me," he said, studying Vanessa again with open amusement. "How long have you been working events like this?" Vanessa turned slightly toward him. "Long enough to recognize people who confuse wealth with character." One of the younger investors at the table suddenly coughed into his drink to hide an awkward laugh. Daniel's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Olivia looked offended now. "Excuse me." Vanessa remained perfectly calm beneath the chandelier light. "Nothing," she replied softly. "Just an observation." Nearby conversations had started slowing as more guests quietly noticed the exchange unfolding at the Whitmore table. A pair of executives near the ballroom entrance whispered to each other while glancing toward Vanessa with growing recognition. One older woman from a banking firm froze mid-sentence after finally getting a clear look at Vanessa's face. "No," she whispered under her breath almost immediately. "That cannot be her." But before she could move closer, Charles Whitmore returned from a private phone call near the West Corridor. At 68, Charles carried himself with the polished authority of old American money. Silver hair, tailored tuxedo, calm posture built from decades of boardrooms and cameras. Yet tonight, exhaustion shadowed his face beneath the ballroom lights. He approached the table distracted, still focused on the financial disaster waiting for him tomorrow morning. "Have we heard anything from Cole and Mercer yet?" he asked sharply, loosening one cufflink. Their legal team was supposed to confirm final signatures tonight. Daniel shrugged casually. "Relax, Dad. These finance people always drag things out to feel important." Charles did not smile. "This deal is the only thing standing between us and a credit downgrade." His voice came out lower than intended, more honest. For a brief moment, fear slipped through the polished image. Vanessa watched him carefully without speaking. Charles finally noticed her standing beside the table and frowned slightly. "And who is this?" Before anyone else could answer, Olivia waved dismissively. "Some event staff member who accidentally wandered into the VIP section." Vanessa slowly lifted her eyes toward Charles Whitmore. Calm, unshaken, intelligent. For half a second, something flickered across Charles's face. Confusion, perhaps. Recognition almost forming somewhere deep in memory. But Daniel interrupted before the thought could settle. "Do not worry," he said with a grin. "She was just leaving." Vanessa glanced once toward the ballroom windows where rain streaked softly against the Manhattan skyline like silver lines across black glass. Then she looked back at the Whitmores, the family desperately waiting for a deal they no longer realized was already slipping through their fingers. Vanessa Cole had spent most of her life learning how to survive rooms exactly like this one. Rooms where people smiled while measuring your worth. Rooms where old money spoke softly but judged loudly. Rooms where being underestimated could either destroy you or become your greatest advantage. The ballroom lights reflected against the rain outside as she stood near the Whitmore table, calm beneath the weight of their assumptions. Around her, Conversations slowly resumed, though quieter now, cautious in a way they had not been 10 minutes earlier. Charles Whitmore loosened his tie slightly and reached for a glass of sparkling water instead of champagne. His hand trembled almost invisibly before steadying again. The pressure surrounding him was becoming harder to hide. Tomorrow has to go smoothly. He muttered more to himself than anyone else. If the board senses weakness, they will tear this company apart before noon. Olivia crossed her arms. You are acting like the world is ending. Because it might be, Charles answered sharply. That finally silenced the table. Daniel looked irritated by the tension creeping into the evening. Dad, you are overreacting again. Once this acquisition closes, everybody calms down. The stock rebounds. The press moves on. Problem solved. Charles stared at his son for a long moment before answering. You still do not understand the situation, do you? His voice stayed controlled, but exhaustion sat heavily beneath every word. Cole and Mercer is not investing in us because they need us. They are doing it because they believe we are still salvageable. Daniel rolled his eyes slightly. Same difference. No, Charles replied quietly. Not even close. Vanessa listened silently while the violin music drifted through the ballroom again. Somewhere behind her, servers carried trays of lobster risotto and filet mignon through the crowd, while wealthy donors laughed beside million-dollar auction displays. The entire gala looked flawless from a distance, but up close, cracks were beginning to show everywhere. Investors whispering near the bar. Board members checking phones every few minutes. Financial reporters circling downstairs like sharks waiting for blood in the water. Whitmore Global was dying slowly in public, and everyone important in Manhattan could already smell it. Near the ballroom entrance, the nervous corporate attorney finally spotted Vanessa across the room. His face drained of color almost instantly. He whispered something urgently to another executive standing beside him. Then both men froze. Oh God! The second man breathed quietly. The Whitmores have no idea. But neither moved toward the table yet. Fear held them still. Vanessa turned slightly toward the towering windows overlooking the city. Rain streaked across the glass while traffic lights shimmered red and gold 30 floors below. For a moment, the reflection staring back at her looked less like a billionaire investor and more like the exhausted daughter of a Baltimore janitor who used to study business textbooks under fluorescent laundromat lights after midnight because the apartment electricity kept failing. She remembered her mother coming home with swollen feet after 12-hour cleaning shifts. Remembered watching wealthy hotel guests avoid eye contact with her family in elevators as if poverty might spread through the air. Back then, Vanessa promised herself something quietly. If she ever gained power, she would never become the kind of person who forgot what dignity looked like. That promise was the only reason she had not walked out already. You know what I think? Olivia said suddenly, interrupting the silence. I think people have gotten far too comfortable forgetting their place these days. Vanessa slowly looked back toward her. Daniel smirked into his drink. Especially in New York. Charles rubbed his forehead wearily, too distracted to notice where the conversation was heading. Can we not do this tonight? Olivia ignored him completely. Her eyes stayed fixed on Vanessa now with cold curiosity. Tell me something, she asked. Who invited you in here? The question settled heavily between them. Nearby guests had started watching openly now. Nobody pretended otherwise anymore. Vanessa held Olivia's gaze for several seconds before answering. The same thing that invited everyone else, she said softly. Opportunity. Daniel laughed once under his breath. That is a very ambitious answer for event staff. Vanessa did not respond immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the attorney near the ballroom entrance who now looked one panic attack away from collapsing entirely. Then she returned her attention to the Whitmores. Calm, patient, almost sympathetic. Because while they still believed they were judging her worth, they had no idea she had already begun deciding theirs. The rain outside Manhattan had grown heavier by the time dinner service began, streaking the ballroom windows in silver lines that blurred the city lights into something softer and colder. Inside the Grand Meridian, the air still smelled of expensive perfume, polished marble, and old money trying desperately not to panic. Vanessa Cole remained beside the Whitmore table while servers moved carefully around her carrying plates balanced like fragile art pieces beneath the chandelier glow. The orchestra shifted into a slower melody now, quieter, elegant enough to hide the tension building underneath the room. Charles Whitmore barely touched the food placed in front of him. He kept checking his phone every few minutes, waiting for updates that never seemed to come fast enough. Across Wall Street, rumors were spreading faster than his public relations team could contain them. Investors wanted reassurance. Board members wanted guarantees. Banks wanted answers. And tomorrow morning's agreement with Cole and Mercer Capital was supposed to calm all of it before the market opened. Daniel, meanwhile, looked almost entertained by the pressure crushing his father. "You need to stop acting like this is life or death," he said casually while slicing into his filet mignon. "It is embarrassing." Charles looked up slowly. Embarrassing? His voice stayed low, but something dangerous flickered beneath it. "Do you have any idea how close this company is to collapsing?" Daniel shrugged. "We still have assets worth billions. Assets mean nothing when confidence disappears." Olivia reached for her wine glass with visible irritation. "Can we please stop discussing financial problems in public?" Her eyes shifted toward Vanessa again, especially in front of staff. Vanessa said nothing. She simply stepped slightly aside to allow another server through the narrow space beside the table. The young waitress from earlier returned carrying fresh champagne flutes, though her hands still shook from Olivia's humiliation. As she leaned forward to place a glass near Daniel, one of the crystal forks slipped slightly against the tablecloth and clinked against his plate. The sound was tiny, barely noticeable, but Daniel exhaled dramatically as if personally offended by the inconvenience. "Seriously," he muttered. "Do they train anybody anymore?" The waitress immediately apologized. "I am so sorry, sir." Daniel barely looked at her. "Maybe try not acting nervous for 5 seconds. The girl lowered her eyes quickly, face burning red beneath the ballroom lights. Vanessa watched her silently for a moment before reaching over and gently straightening the tilted silverware herself. "There," she said softly to the waitress. "You are all right." Olivia gave a dry laugh. "You really enjoy playing hero for the help, do you not?" Vanessa slowly turned toward her. "I enjoy basic respect." The answer landed harder than Olivia expected. Nearby conversations quieted again. A hedge fund manager 2 tables away openly stopped eating to listen now. Daniel leaned back in his chair with growing annoyance. "You know, for someone working service tonight, you seem very comfortable talking back to people above your pay grade." Vanessa met his eyes evenly. "And you seem very comfortable assuming you know who deserves dignity." Daniel smirked coldly. "Please, people earn dignity." "No," Vanessa replied quietly. "They reveal it." For a second, nobody moved. Even the orchestra seemed distant now beneath the weight of the silence settling across the table. Then Daniel laughed softly and leaned toward her slightly. "You people always say things like that right before asking for money." The words hung in the air ugly and sharp beneath the chandelier light. A nearby couple exchanged horrified glances immediately. One of the violinists near the stage faltered half a beat before recovering. Olivia did not correct her son. Charles finally looked up from his phone with visible discomfort crossing his tired face. "Daniel," he warned quietly. But Daniel only lifted his bourbon glass, still amused with himself. Vanessa stood perfectly still, calm, controlled. Yet something changed in her eyes then. Not anger, not humiliation, disappointment. The kind that came from recognizing exactly who someone truly was the moment they stopped pretending to be polite. Across the ballroom, the nervous corporate attorney nearly dropped his phone when he heard Daniel's comment. He immediately started walking toward the Whitmore table, face pale beneath the golden ballroom lights. Another executive hurried after him, but they were already too late. Because Vanessa Cole had just finished deciding what kind of people the Whitmores really were. And somewhere deep beneath the polished glamour of the gala, the future of their empire quietly began falling apart. The silence after Daniel Whitmore's comment felt heavier than the music drifting through the ballroom. Even the waiters moved more carefully now, sensing something invisible shifting beneath the polished surface of the evening. Vanessa Cole stood motionless beside the table while rain continued sliding down the towering glass windows overlooking Manhattan. The city beyond the ballroom looked cold and distant, blurred beneath streaks of silver water and flashing headlights 30 floors below. Daniel took another sip of bourbon as if nothing important had happened. "What?" he asked casually, noticing the uncomfortable looks around him. "Everybody is suddenly pretending they do not know what I meant." Olivia adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist and avoided eye contact with the nearby guests. Charles Whitmore closed his eyes briefly, like a man fighting off a headache that had lasted too many years already. "Enough, Daniel," he said quietly. "No," Daniel replied with a shrug. "I am tired of everybody acting sensitive all the time." Vanessa slowly placed her untouched champagne glass onto the white tablecloth with careful precision. The soft clink against the crystal surface sounded strangely loud in the silence. Nearby conversations had almost completely stopped now. Several guests openly stared toward the Whitmore table while pretending not to. The orchestra continued playing in the background, but even the violin melody sounded tense beneath the chandelier glow. Across the ballroom, the corporate attorney hurried forward, breathing hard as he pushed through clusters of wealthy donors and executives. "Mr. Whitmore," he called nervously. "Sir, I really think we need to speak privately." Charles looked irritated immediately. "Not now. It cannot wait." Daniel leaned back with visible annoyance. "Why does everybody suddenly look like someone died?" The attorney stopped beside the table, chest rising quickly beneath his tuxedo jacket. His eyes flicked nervously toward Vanessa before immediately lowering again. Sweat glistened along his forehead despite the cool air flowing through the ballroom. "Sir," he said carefully, almost whispering now, "there has been a misunderstanding." Olivia frowned. "What are you talking about?" The attorney swallowed hard. "The representative from Cole and Mercer Capital arrived earlier than expected tonight." Charles straightened slightly in his chair. "And?" The attorney hesitated. Vanessa remained perfectly still beside them, calm beneath the ballroom lights while Daniel watched the scene unfold with growing confusion. Finally, the attorney forced himself to continue. "She is already here." Charles immediately looked around. "The ballroom? Where?" The attorney slowly turned his eyes toward Vanessa. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The realization did not hit all at once. It spread slowly across the table like ice forming over dark water. Olivia's expression froze first. Then Charles. Daniel looked between them with confusion before finally turning toward Vanessa again, this time actually seeing her for the first time all evening. The emerald gown, the calm posture, the complete absence of fear, the subtle confidence no ordinary employee would ever carry in a room like this. "No," Daniel muttered softly. "Wait." Charles Whitmore stood up, so quickly his chair nearly tipped backward. "Vanessa Cole?" His voice sounded hollow now. Vanessa met his eyes calmly. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore." The ballroom around them seemed to disappear into silence. Nearby executives stopped speaking entirely. One woman near the stage covered her mouth with her hand in disbelief. Daniel stared at Vanessa as if the floor beneath him had suddenly vanished. "You are the CEO?" he asked quietly. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. "That is usually what people call me." Olivia's face drained of color. "But you were standing here all night and never said anything." Vanessa's expression never changed. "You never asked." Nobody at the table had an answer for that. The orchestra continued softly in the background while rain tapped gently against the windows overlooking Manhattan. Charles looked physically ill now. Every terrible moment from the evening replayed across his face all at once. The insults, the assumptions, the humiliation. Daniel slowly set down his bourbon glass with trembling fingers. "Miss Cole," Charles began carefully, "I believe there has been a terrible misunderstanding tonight." Vanessa looked at him for several long seconds before answering. "No," she said quietly. "There has been a very clear understanding of exactly who everyone is." And somewhere deep beneath the glittering lights of the gala, the Whitmore family finally realized they had not embarrassed a stranger tonight. They had humiliated the only person standing between their empire and complete financial collapse. The ballroom no longer sounded the same after the truth came out. The music still played. Glasses still clinked softly beneath the chandeliers. Wealthy guests still moved through the room in polished tuxedos and shimmering gowns. But now every sound carried tension beneath it, thin and sharp like ice cracking across deep water. Vanessa Cole stood calmly beside the Whitmore table while silence spread outward through the crowd in slow waves. Nobody looked at her the same way anymore. Charles Whitmore seemed to age 10 years in less than a minute. The color had drained from his face completely, leaving behind only exhaustion and disbelief. He opened his mouth once, closed it again, then finally forced himself to speak. "Miss Cole," he said carefully, I sincerely apologize for what happened tonight. Vanessa looked at him quietly. Rain tapped softly against the ballroom windows behind her, while Manhattan glowed silver and gold through the storm outside. Do you? She asked. The question was not loud, not angry. Somehow that made it worse. Charles swallowed hard. Of course I do. Vanessa glanced briefly toward Daniel, who had not touched his drink since learning who she was. His earlier confidence had vanished completely now, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that every careless word he spoke tonight had carried consequences far beyond embarrassment. Olivia Whitmore looked equally shaken, though pride still lingered stubbornly across her expression. She straightened the diamond bracelet on her wrist again, as if expensive jewelry could somehow restore control over the room. Surely, Olivia said cautiously, we can move past unfortunate misunderstandings. Vanessa slowly turned toward her. Is that what you call it? Olivia hesitated. I think emotions simply escalated before we understood who you were. Vanessa held her gaze for several seconds before answering. That is exactly the problem. Nobody interrupted her now. Nearby guests listened openly. Even the orchestra seemed quieter beneath the weight of her voice. You believed respect depended on my title. Vanessa continued softly. The moment you thought I was ordinary, your kindness disappeared. Daniel lowered his eyes. Toward the table, Charles rubbed his forehead with trembling fingers. Across the ballroom, several executives exchanged uncomfortable looks because they knew she was right. Vanessa stepped away from the table slowly and walked toward the towering windows overlooking the city. Her heels clicked softly against polished marble while the ballroom lights shimmered across the rain-streaked glass ahead of her. Nobody stopped her. Nobody spoke. Outside, Manhattan looked cold and endless beneath the storm clouds rolling over the Hudson River. Yellow taxi lights blurred below like drifting sparks beneath dark water. Vanessa rested one hand lightly against the cool glass and exhaled slowly. For the first time all evening, the exhaustion finally reached her. Not exhaustion from business, not from negotiations. Exhaustion from years of walking into rooms where people measured her worth before hearing her voice. Years of being mistaken for assistants, hotel staff, event workers, anything except the woman who built one of the most powerful investment firms in the country from nothing but intelligence, discipline, and sleepless nights. She remembered sitting beside her mother in a tiny Baltimore apartment while rain leaked through cracked window frames during winter storms. Remembered watching her mother remove hotel cleaning gloves with swollen hands after 14-hour shifts. Never let bitterness make you cruel, her mother used to tell her quietly. People will show you who they are. Let them. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly as the memory settled over her like warmth beneath the cold city lights. Then her phone vibrated softly inside her clutch purse. She opened it slowly. A message from her chief financial officer appeared across the screen. Final acquisition documents ready for signature at 8 a.m. awaiting your authorization. Vanessa stared at the message while thunder rolled faintly somewhere beyond the skyline. Behind her, the Whitmore family waited in complete silence. Waiting for forgiveness perhaps. Waiting for reassurance. Waiting for the woman they humiliated to save them anyway. Vanessa looked down at the glowing screen for several long seconds before calmly opening a new email draft. Subject line: Termination of acquisition agreement. Her fingers hovered silently above the keyboard while rain continued sliding down the ballroom windows beside her. And behind the glittering luxury of the Gala, an empire stood unknowingly on the edge of collapse. The ballroom lights suddenly felt too bright for the Whitmore family. Every crystal chandelier overhead seemed to expose them more clearly now, stripping away the illusion of control they had carried into the evening. Vanessa Cole remained near the rain-covered windows with her phone resting quietly in one hand, while the unfinished email glowed against the darkness of the screen. Behind her, the orchestra continued playing soft piano arrangements, but nobody in the ballroom was listening anymore. The attention of the entire room had narrowed to one woman standing silently beside the Manhattan skyline, and one billionaire family realizing their future, now, depended entirely on her mercy. Charles Whitmore slowly stepped away from the table first. His polished confidence had disappeared completely. He no longer looked like the powerful head of a financial empire. He looked like an exhausted man trying to stop a fire after smelling smoke too late. "Miss Cole," he said carefully as he approached her near the windows. Please allow us the chance to make this right. Vanessa did not turn around immediately. Rain slid softly down the glass beside her, while thunder rumbled faintly beyond the city. Make what right? She asked quietly. Charles hesitated. Everything. Vanessa finally looked back at him. Calm eyes. Tired eyes. Eyes that had spent years watching people reveal their character the moment they believed nobody important was watching. Your son insulted me before he knew my title, she said softly. Your wife dismissed me before she knew my net worth. You treated me with respect only after discovering I could help you. Charles lowered his eyes briefly because there was no defense against the truth. Olivia remained near the table, visibly uncomfortable beneath the growing attention of nearby guests. She had spent most of her life believing social status protected people from consequences. Tonight that belief was collapsing in front of her. Daniel looked worse. The arrogance that once sat so naturally across his face had vanished entirely now, replaced by shame and disbelief. He stared at the marble floor for several long seconds before finally forcing himself to walk toward Vanessa as well. Miss Cole, he began quietly, I crossed a line earlier. Vanessa studied him silently. Daniel swallowed hard before continuing. There is no excuse for what I said. The words sounded unfamiliar coming from him, heavy and awkward like something he had never practiced before. Vanessa watched him carefully while the city lights reflected against the rain behind her. No, she replied softly. There is not. Daniel nodded once, unable to argue. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in his entire life, he understood what it felt like to realize money could not immediately repair the damage caused by arrogance. Nearby executives pretended to continue conversations while openly listening to every word. Several investors had already begun quietly checking market forecasts on their phones. They understood exactly what was happening here. If Cole and Mercer walked away from tomorrow's acquisition, Whitmore Global would not survive the quarter intact. Vanessa glanced back down at the unfinished email glowing softly on her screen. Termination of acquisition agreement. One tap. That was all it would take now. $5 billion gone. Thousands of employees thrown into uncertainty. Decades of family legacy erased by pride and prejudice dressed in expensive clothing. Charles followed her gaze toward the phone and visibly paled. Please, he said quietly. Do not make tonight's mistakes destroy everything we built. Vanessa looked at him for a long moment before answering. That is the difference between us, Mr. Whitmore. Charles frowned slightly. Vanessa slipped her phone slowly back into her clutch purse. You believe wealth is what builds empires. The rain continued tapping softly against the glass as she stepped away from the window. But character is what keeps them standing. Nobody spoke after that. The orchestra played quietly. Somewhere behind them, while the ballroom remained frozen beneath the weight of her words. Then Vanessa reached for her coat resting across the back of a nearby chair. The movement was small, calm, elegant. Yet the moment Charles Whitmore saw it, panic flashed visibly across his face because he suddenly understood exactly what it meant. Vanessa Cole was preparing to leave, and the moment she walked out of that ballroom, the Whitmore empire might walk out with her. The ballroom had become painfully quiet by the time Vanessa Cole slipped her coat over her shoulders. The silence no longer came from confusion. It came from fear. Every executive in the room understood what was hanging in the balance now. $5 billion. Thousands of jobs. An empire built over 3 generations standing on the edge of financial collapse because one family could not recognize dignity when it stood directly in front of them. Rain continued falling outside the towering windows while the Manhattan skyline glowed through the storm like scattered gold beneath dark clouds. The orchestra near the stage had stopped entirely now. Even the musicians sensed the evening had transformed into something far more serious than a charity gala. Charles Whitmore stepped forward quickly as Vanessa prepared to leave. Miss Cole, please, he said, his voice lower than before. More human now. I am asking you not as a businessman tonight, but as someone trying to save what remains of his family. Vanessa paused beside the marble staircase leading toward the ballroom exit. Behind her, cameras from social reporters still flashed near the entrance lobby downstairs, unaware that the real story of the night had nothing to do with charity auctions or political speeches. It was happening here, in silence. Olivia Whitmore approached slowly as well, though pride still lingered visibly beneath her discomfort. She had spent decades controlling rooms with wealth, reputation, and social influence. Apologizing did not come naturally to her. But tonight, for the first time in many years, even she understood that money no longer gave her power over the situation. "Miss Cole," Olivia began carefully, "I owe you an apology." Vanessa turned toward her calmly. Olivia looked down briefly before continuing. "What I said earlier was wrong. The assumptions we made were wrong." The words sounded stiff, unfamiliar, but genuine enough to carry weight. Vanessa studied her quietly while rain tapped softly against the glass walls surrounding the ballroom. "You were not reacting to me," Vanessa replied. "You were reacting to who you thought I was." Olivia lowered her eyes because she knew it was true. Daniel stood several feet behind his parents, silent beneath the chandelier light. He looked nothing like the confident heir who mocked her hours earlier. His expensive tuxedo suddenly seemed too small for the shame sitting across his face. Finally, he stepped forward as well. "I spent my whole life believing people respected us because we earned it," he admitted quietly. "Tonight, I realized most people were just afraid to challenge us." Vanessa watched him carefully. "And how does that feel?" Daniel gave a small bitter laugh without humor. "Honestly," he looked around the ballroom slowly. "Lonely." For a moment, nobody spoke. The city lights shimmered faintly across the rain-soaked windows while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the Hudson River. Vanessa glanced toward the young waitress she had defended earlier. The girl still stood near the service entrance watching nervously, unsure whether she should stay or disappear. Vanessa reached into her clutch purse and quietly removed the folded $100 bill Daniel had pushed toward her earlier. She walked calmly across the ballroom and handed it to the waitress instead. "Use this for school," she said softly, "or for something that belongs to your future." The young woman stared at the bill with trembling hands and watery eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Vanessa smiled gently before turning back toward the Whitmores one final time. "Do you know the dangerous thing about power?" she asked quietly. Charles looked at her without speaking. "Eventually," Vanessa continued, "people stop telling you the truth because they think your money matters more than your character." The words settled deeply across the room. No anger. No revenge. Just truth spoken plainly beneath chandelier light and falling rain. Charles slowly nodded as if each sentence carried the weight of something he already knew but spent years avoiding. Vanessa reached for the ballroom doors, then paused once more. "Your company can still survive this," she said softly. Hope flashed across Charles Whitmore's face instantly. But Vanessa's eyes never changed. "Whether your family deserves to is a different question." And with that, she opened her phone one final time beneath the glow of the Manhattan skyline, her thumb hovering silently above the unfinished email that could either save an empire or let it collapse beneath the weight of its own arrogance. The ballroom doors opened slowly as Vanessa Cole stepped into the marble corridor overlooking the rain-soaked Manhattan streets below. Behind her, silence lingered inside the Grand Meridian like smoke after a fire. Nobody rushed to stop her this time. Nobody laughed anymore. The same people who dismissed her hours earlier now stood frozen beneath the chandeliers, watching the woman they underestimated walk away with the future of their empire resting quietly inside her phone. Outside the tall glass walls, the storm had softened into a cold, steady rain. Yellow taxi lights drifted through the wet streets below, while distant sirens echoed faintly between the buildings of Midtown. Vanessa walked calmly toward the private elevator near the end of the corridor, her heels clicking softly against polished stone. The emerald stain from the spilled wine still marked her gown, though she no longer seemed to notice it. Somewhere behind her, the ballroom orchestra had started playing again, but the music sounded hollow now, like a performance continuing after the audience already understood how the story would end. Charles Whitmore remained standing near the ballroom entrance, shoulders heavy beneath his tuxedo jacket. He looked older than he had at the beginning of the night. Smaller somehow. Olivia sat quietly at the table staring down at untouched champagne, while Daniel stood beside the windows alone, watching rain slide across the glass in slow silver streaks. For the first time in his life, nobody at the gala approached him with admiration. Nobody laughed at his jokes. Nobody rushed to stand near the Whitmore family anymore. Power had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it. The young waitress Vanessa defended earlier slowly approached Daniel with trembling hands. "Sir," she whispered nervously, holding out the folded $100 bill. Daniel looked down at it silently. The bill suddenly felt heavier than money should feel. She gave this to me, the waitress explained softly. For my future. Daniel stared at the folded cash for several long seconds before slowly pushing it back toward her. Keep it, he said quietly. The waitress looked surprised. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the marble floor. And I am sorry. The words barely rose above a whisper, but they were real. Nearby, Charles Whitmore finally sat down heavily at the table, rubbing both hands across his exhausted face. I built this company believing strength meant control, he murmured quietly. Olivia looked at him without speaking. Charles stared out toward the hallway where Vanessa disappeared moments earlier. But she walked into this room with more dignity than all of us combined. Nobody answered him because there was nothing left to defend. At the far end of the corridor, Vanessa reached the private elevator overlooking the city skyline. A valet attendant hurried forward holding a black umbrella for her while the elevator doors slid open silently beside them. Vanessa paused one last time before stepping inside. Her phone still rested in her hand. The unfinished email remained open on the screen beneath the soft glow of the elevator lights. Termination of acquisition agreement. Her thumb hovered above the send button while rain whispered softly against the glass walls surrounding the building. For several seconds, she said nothing. Did nothing. Then slowly, Vanessa closed the email without sending it. Not because the Whitmores deserved rescue. Not because money erased what happened tonight. But because thousands of innocent employees working across Whitmore Global did not deserve to lose their futures because of one family's arrogance. Vanessa slipped the phone back into her purse and stepped into the elevator quietly. Downstairs, the city waited beneath the rain. The doors began closing slowly, reflecting the golden ballroom lights one final time across the polished steel surface. Just before the elevator sealed shut completely, Daniel Whitmore appeared at the far end of the corridor. He stopped running the moment he saw her. Neither of them spoke. Vanessa simply looked at him calmly as the elevator doors continued sliding together.